Thank you for that introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me to be here today. As was just noted, what I'm going to talk about today differs a little bit from some of the conversation that we've been having so far. I am not an economist, and even though I have, in some of my work, written about some of the issues we've been talking about around debt and credit, around financialization, around central banking, and in particular sort of masculinities in central banking. I've written about this sort of thing in the past, but I'm talking today about something a little bit different from that, though it does link very nicely with the conversation that's been started in the earlier session around the difference, I think we can say, between what we might think of as the economics of women as opposed to feminist economics. And I think that those are different things. And I wanted to draw attention to some of that today and talk about some of those relations of power that were alluded to in the previous session, and in particular to talk about some of those relations of power in terms of determining who it is who is producing knowledge about gender in the contemporary global political economy. What I was going to do in this presentation is two things. The presentation's organized around looking at some of the new multifaceted ways in which gender equality is itself being linked to processes of financial deepening and processes of financialization. And what I'm particularly going to focus on here is the role that a number of large corporations, and particularly large banks and financial firms, are playing in promoting the notion that financial empowerment is the key, if not the most important means of establishing gender equality. And I don't think it's possible to understand this development as either entirely positive or entirely negative. I mean, there's first of all a lot of different groups who are involved in promoting financial empowerment, and also the effects of the different projects that are at work really vary, and a lot more research needs to be done in order to understand this. But what I'm going to do here is take a bit more of a political science / sociological approach to thinking about some of the different narratives that are at play here and thinking about some of the things that they are doing. In terms of linking gender equality to financialization, I think most of us are aware that gender equality has been on the global governance agenda since at least 1995, since at least the Beijing Platform for Action. And I'm not really going to spend much time rehearsing the debates, the sort of shift from women in development to gender in development. But the important point to note is that the earlier women in development type approaches tended to advocate quite instrumentalist understandings of women's equality. And what they really did was to link quite directly gender equality to women's participation in the market, which was a good thing because it promoted national development. And the approaches that came later were critical of that, and they sort of challenged a lot of these instrumentalist notions, and the gender and development literature departed from some of this instrumentalism. But I think that now we really are witnessing a return to these instrumentalist agendas and how they are articulated through what we can broadly think of as the business case for gender equality. And again, a number of different actors are involved in promoting the business case for gender equality. These are just a few examples here. I'm not supposed to turn away from the microphone, so I'm going to have to sort of look behind me. But we're talking about different groups, the World Bank's World Development Report. There's also some private sector organizations like McKinsey & Company who produce this Women Matters research. We've got the World Economic Forum and their global gender gap reports, which are linking gender gaps to economic competitiveness. So there's a number of different institutions that are involved in this and a number of different reports and indicators that are being developed around the business case for gender equality. And a lot of these have been critiqued by feminist scholars on a number of different grounds, which again, I'm not really going to get into here, because what I want to focus on in particular are the ways in which a growing number of public and private development initiatives are creating discourses and are designing programs that are based on a supposed win-win relationship between financial deepening and gender equality. So it's not just about these institutions and reports and rankings, but in particular, I wanted to talk about some of the corporations and philanthropic organizations that have been involved in promoting the business case for gender equality. And again, these are just a few examples here. We've got Nike's Girl Effect. We've got Goldman Sachs's 10,000 Women program, which I'm going to talk a bit more about later. This is Goldman Sachs's Womenomics research, which I think is a really good example of the economics of women rather than feminist economics. We've got Walmart empowering women. Coca-Cola is involved in a number of different organizations. The UN Global Compact, which is basically a corporate social responsibility organization, has teamed up with UN Women to create the Women's Empowerment Principles. So these are the types of initiatives that I'm interested in looking at. And again, they promote gender equality in different ways. And I've looked at some of these institutions more specifically in my research, but in sort of general terms, which is what I'm speaking about here, they tend to focus on the need to invest in the human capital of women and girls, particularly in the areas of health and education. And they tend to focus on the importance of promoting women's entry into the labor market, particularly through women's entrepreneurship. And as part of this, then, they're very much interested in promoting women's access to finance and in promoting financial literacy initiatives. So just to give you an example, to put your sort of hands around about how some of this works, if we look at Koch's Global Women's Initiative, this is something that was started in 2007 between Koch and the Kennedy School at Harvard. The World Bank and their International Finance Corporation are involved, and what they've tried to do is to identify the major obstacles for female entrepreneurs in Koch's markets. And what they found was that this includes the lack of business skills, lack of peer mentors, lack of access to finance. And this is important to Koch because they've believe and they've recognized that women are key players throughout their supply chain. So women own small businesses that sell Coke products. Women scavenge Coke bottles that are then recycled. Women are the primary buyers of Coke products. So women are incredibly important for Coke as a corporation. And what they do, after recognizing this through this program, is then, one of the things that they do is to promote the need to extend access to finance for women-owned suppliers and distributors in emerging markets. And their 5x20 initiatives does similar types of things. So the point is that finance is really important for a lot of these different types of initiatives. Now, people have talked about this, and feminists have talked about this from sort of a development type approach, but I think that there's something that we can learn about thinking about these initiatives in relationship to processes of financialization more broadly. Why do I think this is the case? Well, financialization, if we think of financialization as more than just being about financial markets, more than just being about the growing profitability of accumulation through finance as opposed to manufacturing, but if we think about financialization as entailing much broader changes in society, one of the things that financialization represents is the diffusion of finance into more and more spaces and to more and more aspects of everyday life. What we see with these initiatives, then, they represent, in part, a geographical expansion of finance. So finance is expanding through these types of initiatives, and this is linked to the growing attention that financiers and lenders and others have been paying to what's called the bottom of the pyramid market. So it's been identified that there's great profits to be gained from focusing on the bottom of the pyramid market, and that's part of what is shaping some of these initiatives. I think a second way that we can think about how these processes are linked to financialization is that they're tied to the growing financialization of social reproduction. What I mean by that is that in most of the conversations that currently dominate around financialization, we tend to be thinking still about this as something that is fundamentally about the relations of production. But actually, the way that human beings, the way that families, the way that communities reproduce themselves on a daily and generational basis is itself increasingly being tied up with financial processes. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And the first one is through debt and through credit, which is something that Brigitte talked about a little bit earlier. So what we see in a lot of, in particular, advanced OECD countries is that more and more families and households are having to rely on credit as a means of ensuring their daily reproductive needs. And this is quite new. What I think happened in the wake of previous financial crises, and we know this from decades of feminist economics research and gender and development research, in the wake of previous financial crises, women often tended to pick up the sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? They addressed all of the insecurities created by structural adjustment policies, created by government cutbacks through increasing their unpaid domestic labor. And in the current crisis, we still know that this is the case. So there are all kinds of studies that have documented an increase in women's unpaid domestic labor in the wake of the crisis, but also more and more families are relying on debt to meet their basic needs. So they're relying on credit cards to pay for food, they're relying on all kinds of other small loans, payday lenders, things like that, in order to meet the basic necessities. But this poses a contradiction for itself, I think, because studies have come out in the UK that have shown, for instance, that one of the leading causes of families having to rely on food banks is the growing indebtedness of households. So people are having to rely on debt to pay for the means of reproduction, and then this is posing serious problems to reproduction itself. But that's just one example, and there are a number of other ones. A second example of the ways in which social reproduction is being financialized, and again drawing on the example of the UK, is through the selling off of elderly care homes to financial investors. So what we've seen in the UK is that a number of care homes have been sold to private equity firms, which have then saddled these care homes with debt, which have led to major restructuring of the provisioning of elderly care in the UK, and again, posing major problems for the reproduction of much of that population. So there's important ways in which social reproduction is being linked to finance that I think still need to be investigated. And here I'm absolutely in support of Brigitte's argument that we just need more research around some of these questions. I was going to go into a third way, but actually I can tell already I'm going to run out of time, so I'm just going to keep going. So those examples, even though I was talking mainly about the UK and about advanced capitalist markets, something that's been observed in relationship to the Global South is the ways in which small loans, microcredit, and more recently, people are talking less and less about microcredit, and they're talking more and more about small loans for entrepreneurship or lending for women-run small and medium enterprises, SMEs. But essentially, these are similar types of schemes. And this is a quote here from Silvia Federici, who has made an argument about the ways in which these small loans, which we call, investments in entrepreneurship, are often actually necessary means that families, and particularly women, rely on in order to ensure their own reproduction. So this fueling of this bottom of the pyramid market itself could potentially be, to follow Silvia Federici, part of this broader trend where we have millions of micro-entrepreneurs investing in their reproduction, presumably free to prosper or fail as their laborosity and sagacity allows. So that's a second way that they're linked to processes of financialization. A third link between some of these initiatives and broader processes of financialization has to do with the ways in which they've perpetuated the expansion and the normalization of financial discourses, including financial discourses about gender equality. So here I think the discourses around gender equality as a dividend, around the gender dividend, are particularly interesting to think about. And what you see from these examples, you've got Deloitte, who, as far as I can tell, was one of the first groups to actually be talking about the gender dividend, which they do through their business research here. But then you also have this discourse of the gender dividend being used by the United Nations. It's being used by the Inter-American Development Bank. There's an example from the business press. So this discourse around gender equality as being a dividend, as being similar to profits made on financial markets, is quite an interesting discourse that I think as feminists is at least worthy of conversation. And the fourth and final way in which these projects and their discourses are linked to financialization has to do with their role in legitimating financial firms as producers of knowledge about women and about gender. And these are many of the examples that I've already given, and I'll speak a bit more about it later. But what's particularly important to me as a feminist is that a lot of this knowledge about women and about gender is actually emptied of feminist content. So there's a discourse about women, and even when they talk about gender, the insights of feminist economics and gender and development and feminist political economy that's been developed over decades is actually missing in the way that a lot of this is presented. And I would say that what we need to do is develop a critical feminist analysis of these discourses and practices and the financialization agendas. And again, ultimately, a lot of this requires research, and I'm just speaking in quite broad terms here. But in the work that I've done, looking at a number of these reports, looking at news articles, looking at speeches that these people have given, a small number of interviews, et cetera, I think that we can identify a few dominant narratives and make some sorts of claims, if not questions, about the types of things that these narratives are doing. So the first dominant narrative then is the quite obvious narrative of financial empowerment. So despite decades of evidence from the field of gender and development that actually disturbs and challenges the notion of a direct link between financial access and women's empowerment, these discourses of financial empowerment have become increasingly central to the international aid industry and the development arms of many states. So everyone's talking about this right now. There are a number of examples: the OECD, this discourse around the need to bank the unbanked, again, the bottom of the pyramid market, financial inclusion agendas. All of these are sort of linked to this notion of financial empowerment as being central to gender equality. But in many of these instances, the term empowerment itself has been individualized and de-linked from questions of broader social transformation. So while feminist activists succeeded in the 1990s in shifting the dominant discourse about women's empowerment as being necessary for development to arguing that empowerment was actually something that was much more a matter of social justice and linked to broader ideas about participation, power, and equality, empowerment itself has become a much more limited and technical term. And you see this with this example. Oh, it's not printed up there very well. But it's from an OECD report, and it's basically talking about financial empowerment in terms of choice for women to choose appropriate financial services and products and to develop and manage entrepreneurial activities. So you have this sort of notion of empowerment as being something that's quite limited, and it's often linked to the success of individual women. And again, depending on what you're looking at, that individual woman might vary. So it could be about the empowerment of women on corporate boards or women in financial firms, or it could be about the empowerment of poor entrepreneurs. But in general, these are quite individualist discourses that depart quite radically from the earlier feminist notions of empowerment as involving things like the success of women's movements, the improvement of gender issues broadly conceived, et cetera, et cetera. And what's particularly problematic, again, given the decades of feminist work around these issues, is that in much of this, there's very little attention paid to the different effects that the entry of women into the economy as financial and economic actors has on women's ongoing responsibility for domestic labor. And then there's very little attention paid to the different ways in which financial inclusion itself affects different groups of women very differently. So again, if we think about some of what came up earlier in relationship to thinking about assets, if people are going into debt, if they're being included into financial markets through loans taken out in order to buy homes, that could potentially be something that could create an appreciating asset, which could be quite beneficial. But if people are entering into credit relations as micro-entrepreneurs or as borrowers of payday lending or using other types of predatory credit, then that relationship is quite different. And this very rarely gets unpacked in these financial inclusion agendas. So we need to pay attention to the differential effects of financial inclusion on different groups of women. The second narrative that is dominant in a lot of these reports is what I've been calling the women as saviors narrative. And this narrative really builds on the idea that access to finance will help to integrate women into the economy as workers and entrepreneurs, as well as consumers. So there's that sort of dual aspect. They're workers, and then they're also consumers who can use credit to buy goods and accumulate assets. This will ultimately have the effect not just of empowering women, but also of stimulating stagnating national economies in the wake of the global financial crisis, and particularly in the global south. And so you hear this discourse a lot around women as untapped resources. If it's the case, though, as the critical literature on financialization suggests, that part of what's driving the expansion and deepening of finance is a crisis in profitability in other parts of the economy. So if part of what's driving financialization is the crisis of profitability in manufacturing and the shifting, what David Harvey calls a spatio-temporal fix, into financial relations, then I would argue that women's bodies have emerged as an important terrain upon which to displace the contradictions of capitalist accumulation. However, as with other spatio-temporal fixes, the positioning of women as supposedly underutilized resources ripe for exploitation by global capital ultimately reproduces further contradictions, not least because it ignores the vast amount of biological and socially reproductive labor that takes up much of women's time and energy. And here I would go back to something that Diane Elson said over a decade ago in the context of structural adjustment policies in the Global South. Women are actually an overutilized rather than an underutilized resource. This discourse draws on essentialized notions of gender, assuming that women are going to be maternal and altruistic, so that's why we assume it's better, it's smarter to invest in women because they're more likely to put that money into their families and ultimately prop up communities. And it fuels what Sylvia Chant calls the feminization of responsibility and/or obligation, while leaving socially constructed masculine behavior intact. What is particularly interesting about a lot of this women as saviors discourses is when you can sort of see it being perpetuated by institutions like, for instance, Goldman Sachs, who uses this type of discourse in its 10,000 Women program. And of course, what this all ignores is Goldman Sachs' own role in bringing about the financial crisis. So I think it's deeply ironic that you have some of these banks and financial firms that were implicated in the crisis in the first place, now saying that what we need to do in order to prevent future crises is actually invest in women. The third discourse that I wanted to talk about is the womenomics discourse. And again, this is specifically a discourse linked to Goldman Sachs, but I'm talking about it here in a slightly broader term. So by womenomics discourses, I mean these discourses around the notion that women are good for business. And it did originate, as far as I can tell, I mean, the term actually trying to do a genealogy of womenomics and look at who's using it where and why is quite interesting, because it's sort of blown up and lots of different people are using it. But as far as I can tell, the term originated with Goldman Sachs's Kathy Matusi, who was looking at the prospects for growth in Japan at the turn of the millennium. So she was quite interested in looking at how Japan, with its notorious demographic crisis, was actually going to be able to continue to grow. And her solution was that women actually represent a very small percentage of the labor force in Japan. And so if we could just get women into the labor force as workers and consumers, this is what would stimulate national growth, which is probably not wrong. But what she did, being a banker then, was to identify those companies that targeted women specifically, so hair salons, banks that had mortgages for women specifically, and she put them into a basket of companies called Womenomics 4.0, and then this was sold as sort of a place where investors should invest because it had the sort of most likely, these were the areas that were most likely to grow. So these were going to be the best types of investment. And then, as I said, the discourse then gets picked up by others, and it's linked to this discourse around the gender dividend. Although the discourse around the gender dividend is slightly different. The discourse around the gender dividend, and particularly as it's promoted by Deloitte, as I showed you earlier, again, is partly about how businesses can make money by investing in women, but it's also making a case for companies themselves to change their gender makeup. And this notion and the way that it gets articulated, I think, is emptied of feminist content because it tends to use a management discourse called the diversity prediction theorem. And what it argues then is that having greater diversity at the highest echelons of corporations, whether it's on corporate boards or whatever, having greater diversity is actually what leads to better decision making. So it's not having women per se on boards or ethnic minorities. This isn't about saying, there's some sort of broader social reason that we should have greater representation of women. It's just about saying having diversity is going to lead to better decision making, and therefore we should all invest in this. And why I think this is interesting and potentially problematic from a feminist perspective is that it absolutely empties financial markets themselves and business of gendered power relations. So statements like this also are quite, what statements like this am I showing? Statements like this are also quite interesting because when you look at the reports that are being published by a lot of the banks and financial firms, you actually see this contrast between the sorts of notions of, well, we should have more women because, and this reappears in a lot of the financial discourse, women make good investors. And women make good investors because women are better at communicating, women are better in having long-term relationships, women are more risk adverse. And of course, we have all kinds of economics reports that have documented and then problematized this in different types of ways. But you have on the one hand this sort of discourse around women inherently being good investors because of their essentialized gendered characteristics. But then what you also see in some of these discussions is a notion that markets themselves are in no way gendered. And these are just a few different examples from different groups of people talking about the ways in which markets themselves are gender blind. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're a man or woman, markets just continue to operate as they operate. And I think that this contradiction within this discourse itself is interesting because it suggests that even on its own terms, womenomics has a contradiction that stems from its commitment to a neoclassical view of markets as objective, natural, and neutral, and the broader discourses of gender equality with which it is so often aligned. So I think it's quite interesting to think about what would happen if we brought feminism into womenomics and if it would help itself sort of resolve some of these contradictions. So just to conclude then, the aim of my talk has simply been to sort of stimulate a conversation to address this question of financialization and gender from a different perspective. I wanted to draw out and to critically interrogate some of the ways in which gender equality has been articulated under these broad conditions of financialization, which I think also challenges us to think about financialization differently, to think about the social relations that both condition and are reproduced by financialization as this broad set of economic and social processes. As a growing number of financial firms and corporations have come to articulate their own perspectives on gender equality and to support these views through various projects and initiatives, I think that it's imperative that we as feminists add our voices to the debate. While there are certainly gender disparities in access to finance, and there's absolutely no question about that, I think that we need to be critical about linking gender equality to financial inclusion, and we need to continue to identify, analyze, and theorize the multiple ways in which gender relations and relations of social reproduction more broadly are being restructured through financialization at all of these different sites and scales.